Hi, welcome to chapter 27, and this is Learning Objective 2. And what we're going to look at in this particular learning objective is we're going to discuss the three different types of savings in our economy, and then really drive home that there is a big difference between saving and investment. And investment, most people think that means the stock market. It does not. Okay, so we're going to clarify what we mean in this course by investment. So let's go ahead and start with it. There's a bit of math, so be aware of that, and you can certainly stop and pause it to make sure you understand the math and come back to, we have an example problem in here. So I hope that will make it easier to understand. Okay. So it all starts with these national income accounts. And if you remember when we started talking macro specifically, the national income account, we said that GDP, final market value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year, is equal to consumption, and that's everything that households buy. We call that C, plus investment. We talked about new houses. We talked about businesses expanding, building additional factories and those kind of things. Could also be inventories, or it could also be, sorry, I got lost there. Could also be their physical assets that we buy in furtherance of our business. Plus, government expenditures. We talked about things like roads and police and all of those things, both city, state, and local. And then we said net exports. And remember, that's export minus imports. So the first thing that I want to do here is to close down our economy. And the reason I'm doing this is because it makes it very difficult to explain this if we leave in net exports, because we have to talk about things like exchange rates and interest rates for the rest of the world. So the first thing we're going to do is just imagine that we don't trade with the rest of the world. So we're in a closed economy now. So with that closed economy, we're going to say that GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures. Now, when we look at this, we can get to the idea of how much do we save? How much do households, the government, save? And the idea is the more that we save, we can take that savings and invest it in our economy to create more economic growth. So the first thing I want to do with this is I want to subtract. And we're going to get to it in a very weird way. We're going to take GDP, everything that's produced, right, which would be this variable right here, Y. And we're going to subtract everything that households buy. So minus consumption. Remember, that's household spending. And what we're going to do is to subtract everything the government spends. So minus G. And that is government spending. So on this side, on the left side of the equation, we have everything that's produced, final market value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year, minus everything that households buy, minus everything that government buys. What's left over from this equation must be what we save. And we call this equation right here national savings. So this is national savings. It's kind of a weird way to get to it, but that's how we're going to do it. Okay? And we would denote that with a variable of S. Notice on the right side of the equation, we still have this I. So I'm just going to bring the I down here. And I'm going to say national savings is equal to investment in a closed economy. So savings is always going to equal investment in a closed economy. Okay? So far, so good. Pretty simple. Now what I want to do is to think about, have I drilled down far enough? I mean, I'm kind of interested in how much are households saving? How much is the government saving? So I'm going to add some things to this equation. So let me just jump over here. I'm going to change up colors because we're on a slightly different idea here. So I want to know, jump back over here. Come on, work with me. I know you're here somewhere. Where are you? There we are. Okay, so I'm going to take this idea of national savings is equal to investing, and I'm going to drill down on how much are households saving? How much is the government saving? So I'm going to take this national savings, or this variable S, and I'm going to introduce the idea of taxes, because we don't only just get to spend our money, we also have to pay things like taxes. So I'm going to take national savings and I'm going to break it into two parts. The first part is going to be everything that households save. So households, I'm going to say they take GDP, spend it on rent, they spend it on, food, clothing, shelter, all of those things. So I'm going to call that consumption again. And then I'm going to subtract taxes from that. And your book rewrites this, which is fine. So we're going to just rewrite it really quickly, and we're going to say GDP minus taxes minus consumption. Okay, so we're going to use the second one. Then I want to take savings and break it down into what the government saves. Now what the government saves, the government gets its money from taxes. So I'm going to take taxes here and I'm going to subtract anything that the government spends on transfer payment. Actually, I shouldn't say taxes minus any government spending, roads, infrastructure, all of those things. So if I take all of these savings by households, this GDP minus taxes minus consumption, I'm going to call that private savings. And over here, what the government saves, the taxes minus government spending, which we're going to say T minus G, is going to be public savings. If I add private savings and public savings together, that should equal investment in our economy. Okay, so again, private savings plus public savings is just going to equal our national savings, which always equals investment. So I just broke it down and then kind of showed you where these things come from. Okay, we're going to do an example here in just a moment, but I think this so far, hopefully you have this. Okay, so again, what did we do? We took our national income accounts, we closed down the economy, and now what we're going to do is to take a look at savings is always going to equal investment. And again, when I say savings here, this is national savings. Here is the equation for our national savings. And then what we're going to do is to look at taxes, and we're going to say that national savings, so this is the national savings, is equal to our private savings, which is by households, plus public savings, which is from the government. Okay, now let's further this discussion a little bit, talking about public savings, taxes minus government spending, which we know equals public savings. If the government brings in more taxes than it spends, so this is its kind of, you can think of it this way, if the government worked for a living, this would be its wages, right? And this would be its spending, okay? Well, if we ran our households the way the government runs here, we would decide to, I don't know, quit our job and spend 3 times as much, okay? So often in our economy, taxes are not enough to cover government spending. When that happens, we run what they call a budget deficit. Now, when we run a budget deficit, what this means is government spending is greater than taxes, but more so it means that public savings is negative. And we're not going to tell you that many times. We're going to use the idea that there's a deficit. So the minute you see deficit, know that public savings is negative. There have been times, though, in our economy, I think Bill Clinton was in office last time, where taxes are greater than government spending. So we might have cut budgets or done things like that to get spending under control, or we might have raised taxes. When taxes are greater than government spending, then public savings is going to be positive. I'm going to talk about in a few objectives why this matters, this public saving being negative or positive, meaning is there a budget surplus or a deficit? So if you see surplus, I want you to think positive. Deficit, I want you to think negative. Okay, now we're going to look at a problem and see how this would work out in a test type situation or how we actually do this in the government. So we've got some information about an economy here, and they're asking us to find public saving, net taxes, private saving, national saving, and investment, then changing the scenario slightly and saying that the government's going to cut taxes. And what happens if consumers save the entire tax cut? And what happens if consumers save a third of it and spend the other 2/3 of it? So let's go ahead and start with the first portion of this. So remember, kind of going back to our national income accounts. So we want to find public savings. What is public savings? Taxes minus government spending. Net taxes, that's just going to be T. Private savings, that is GDP minus taxes minus consumption. National savings is going to be GDP minus consumption minus government expenditures and investment, which is going to be I. So I'm going to just again kind of reorganize these so that we can get to where we need to be. So again, kind of looking at this, so we have GDP, right? And let's work it from the bottom up this time. So by that I mean, let's look at, we know that national savings is equal to private savings plus government savings, right? So let's start here with private savings and get some equations going. So here's private savings. GDP minus consumption. Oh, sorry, your book always does it a little bit backwards. I'm not quite used to that. And that's okay. Yeah, it's fine. I'll just correct myself here. So GDP minus, there we go, minus taxes minus consumption plus public savings, which is taxes minus government expenditures. Add the two together, we get national savings. If we get to national savings, we can easily get to investment. Okay, so we have, and I think the easiest way to kind of tackle this problem is to recognize that we have a budget deficit of 1.2 trillion. Our budget deficit would mean that this public savings is going to be negative. And I'm going to go ahead and change the ink color here just so you can easily follow along. So if we know that public savings, which is taxes minus government expenditures, is going to equal negative 1.2 trillion. Now, do we know any of these other variables? Yes, we do. We know that the government is 2.5 trillion. Government spending is 2.5 trillion. So we're going to say taxes minus 2.5 trillion is equal to negative 1.2 trillion. If I add 2.5 trillion, isolate my tax variable here, plus 2.5 trillion, we end up with taxes are equal to 1.3 trillion. Because we need taxes to be able to solve the private savings. Okay, so private savings now we can do using GDP minus taxes minus consumption. They tell us GDP is 19 trillion. 19 trillion minus taxes, we just calculated that here, of 1.3 trillion minus consumption, they tell us is 13 trillion. And if we subtract 19 minus 1.3 minus 13 trillion, we end up with 4.7. So our private savings equals 4.7 trillion. Okay, so we've got private savings. Let's start there. Private savings, 4.7 trillion. We know taxes, right? Taxes, 1.3 trillion. What was public saving? Public saving is always going to be whatever our deficit or surplus says. So our public saving is going to be negative 1.2 trillion. Right? So we remember national savings is just private savings plus public savings. So for national savings, we're going to take the private savings right here of negative, public savings negative 1.2 trillion, and we're going to add to that our private savings of 4.7 trillion, and that's going to equal 3.5 trillion. So national savings is going to be 3.5 trillion. Now remember, national savings is always equal to investment. So in this economy, investment is going to equal 3.5 trillion. Okay, a lot of work there, but I think it kind of makes sense. The next portion of the problem says, if the government cuts taxes by 300 billion, find the new budget deficit and the answers to A. Okay, so it kind of wants to know what all the variables are going to be. So from the previous problem, we had decided that taxes were equal to 1.3 trillion. So if the government cuts taxes, that means we're going to reduce taxes by 0.3 trillion. So taxes now become 1 trillion. So again, kind of going through our steps here, I'm going to start with private, which is, again, we know GDP minus taxes minus consumption. So GDP, 19 trillion minus 1 trillion minus consumption of 13, and we end up with private being, just a minute, I work all these out ahead of time nowadays because, you know, all of the stuff. Private ends up being 5 trillion. Okay. Public, which we said is taxes minus government expenditures. Taxes are now 1 trillion minus government expenditures of 2.5 trillion. It's still negative, and it's to a greater amount, negative 1.5 trillion, right? So you can kind of see how those taxes are influencing us a little bit here, because private is increasing, private savings is increasing, but public savings is actually decreasing. National savings, we're going to add the two together, public and private, and that would be 3.5, I believe. Yeah, national savings is 3.5 trillion. And remember, national savings equals investment. So investment is going to equal 3.5 trillion, which is the same thing that we had in the previous problem, okay? Because they're saving the entire tax cut. It's staying in the national savings. It's just kind of moving itself around from public to private. Okay, now a little bit more difficult. Government's going to cut taxes by 300, find the new budget deficit if consumers save a third and spend the other 2/3. So, okay, so let's think of it this way. So if consumers save, that must mean that national savings is going to increase by a third of the tax cut. And if they spend, so that means consumption is going to increase by 2/3 of the tax cut. So remember that our taxes were originally 1.3. Now we have this tax cut, so of 0.3, right? So we had 1.3 trillion originally. We cut taxes by 0.3 trillion. So let's look at how we're going to apportion this 0.3 trillion. $1 trillion is going to increase which one? Public saving, national saving, private saving. Well, it's going to increase private savings, right? Okay, and 2 billion or 0.2 trillion is going to increase consumption. Okay, they want us to find all the things again. If you're good with this, you can go ahead and move on, but if you're not, let's go ahead and do it. Okay, so again, private savings, GDP, which is 2.5 trillion, minus taxes. Taxes is 1 trillion, minus consumption. Consumption, they said, was 13 trillion, but now we're going to say minus 13.2 trillion. So private now becomes 4.8 trillion. Public is going to be, again, taxes minus government expenditures. Taxes, after the tax cut, are only 1 trillion. So we have 1 trillion minus our government expenditures of 2.5. Is still a budget deficit, but now it has increased to 1.5 trillion. If we want to figure out what national savings is, again, add public and private together. So 4.8 trillion minus 1.5 trillion equals, how about something? 3.3 trillion. And what is investment? The same, at 3.3 trillion. Okay, so why do we care about this? We care about this because a lot of people will run for an elected office talking about cutting taxes. And I suppose it works, right? But it kind of has to look at how are the consumers saving 100% of that? Or are they spending some of it and saving other portions of it? So if they're going to spend, yes, that does increase consumption. That does increase GDP, which does increase joblessness. Job It increases jobs, so decreases the unemployment rate. But we don't know what consumers are going to do, right? So you can see that here, if we save the whole cut, no problem, right? But if we're spending the cut, what happens is we're spending and it actually reduces the investment in our overall economy, because remember, savings has to equal investment. So we're leery of what happens in terms of tax cuts, in terms of economists and our way of thinking. Okay, so another important aspect of this chapter is to really differentiate between saving and investing. So here's an example. Saving, okay? What's left over after consumption and taxes? Notice that households are saving. They might buy stocks and bonds. Look at this, bonds or equities. That's actually economic saving. When you save, do you want a high interest rate or a low interest rate? Savers want a high interest rate. Okay? And buying stocks and bonds is saving. You know, if you put your money in a bank, a certificate of deposit, that's saving. If you buy shares of a mutual fund, again, sounds like it's financial investing, but it's actually saving. Okay? Shares of a mutual fund, saving and checking accounts. I think those are pretty self-explanatory. So if that's what saving is, and it does seem to have some financial investing things in it, what actually is investing? Investment goes back to that idea of capital. Remember, when we talked about the factors of production of land, labor, and capital, we said capital are kind of like those assets. There's an underlying asset to it. Now, again, let's not think about stocks and bonds as assets, but look at some of the examples. I think it makes sense. General Motors spends $250 million to build a new factory. There's our underlying asset. You buy $5,000 worth of, here's your asset, computer equipment for your business. Your parents spend $300,000 to have a, has to be new, house built. And the house being the underlying asset. So if you're trying to figure out if something is saving or if it's an investment, the investment has to have an underlying physical asset. And if it does, it's an investment. Okay? Financial investing in our course, stocks, bonds, that kind of thing is actually going to be saving. So don't fall for that trick when I ask you to categorize saving and investment. Investment, look for that underlying asset. Saving is going to be financial investment or savings accounts, checking accounts, those kinds of things. Okay, that's the end of this learning objective, and I will see you back next time. Thanks, and remember to email me if you have any questions whatsoever. Thanks for your time, attention, and have a great day.